Telling great stories means using this must-have component. Some people like sweets and others don't. Your favorite color might be red while your best friend's is blue. In other words, there are a lot of paths to please people. What works for one may not work for another. In many cases, though, most people will desire the same things, even if they take different forms: shelter, food, climate control. You can travel far and wide, and while you're probably not going to find too many people that don't want a roof over their heads and food on their table, people want to eat and they want to get out of the weather when it's inclement. Food and shelter are two must-have components for living a long, happy, and healthy life for most people. The components of great food are the ingredients, instructions, and the necessary equipment. There are certain things you have to have in different endeavors if you want to produce a predictable result. If you want to tell better stories, you absolutely must include conflict. Imagine a story with no conflict. You meet your friend for lunch. She wants to tell you about her day yesterday. You beg her to give you all the details and wait with anticipation. Your friend excitedly tells you that she woke up, ate breakfast, and went to work. She had a routine day just like most of her other days. She stopped at a gas station on the way home to refuel her car and ran into an old boyfriend. She bought a lottery ticket while she was there and then made her way home. She watched some TV, fooled around online, and then went to bed. She stops talking. You're waiting for something to happen. You ask her if her story is over. She says yes. Then you ask her if she had a boss or coworker that made her day difficult. She says no. Did her old boyfriend cause a big scene? Nope, nothing happened. Did her lottery numbers hit but she lost her ticket? She tells you this didn't happen either. That's about the most boring story anyone has probably told. It's because there's no conflict that needs to be overcome. Embrace conflict in your stories. If there isn't any conflict in the story you're trying to tell, don't expect people to listen. They're not going to read your tale of nothing went wrong and everything was normal. Conflict captures attention. It's why newscasts are mostly about conflict and crisis. A heartwarming or uplifting story might make it into your local news broadcast, but it's going to die quickly of loneliness. The vast majority of stories you'll hear are about conflict. It captures the attention of the audience. That's what you want to do. Be sure to include conflict in your stories, then show how that conflict was overcome. Whether you're telling a story or writing a book, conflict keeps your audience attentive and engaged. Great storytellers always have a clear and defined message. When you finish a great book, you know what happened. That might sound silly, but not all books do this. When people are preparing speeches or attempting to write the next great novel, they don't always stick to a main message, lesson, or theme. They try to include too much. The better stories start out with a definite idea in mind. You know what you're moving towards. You have an idea, and even if you don't know how your story is going to end yet, you know where it's heading. This is true of fiction, nonfiction stories that teach morals and humorous pieces of content. You want to be crystal clear on the central theme. You want your plot to be evident, and once your story kicks into high gear, it shouldn't move from its focus. Learn this lesson from The Old Man and the Sea. Ernest Hemingway's short novel, The Old Man and the Sea, was his last major work of fiction. It was published in 1952 and earned him the 1953 Pulitzer Prize for fiction. Some claim it to be the legendary author's most important work, and if you want a lesson in great storytelling, definitely give it a read. It works in part because it never wavers from a very simple, yet clearly defined plot. It's not confusing. There isn't a lot going on. There are only two main human characters and a third important character, an 18-foot blue marlin. That's it. There are other characters who make very small appearances, but basically these three characters are the entire book. The basic plot to the story is clear and simple. An old fisherman who hasn't caught anything worthwhile in a long time struggles to catch a marlin of massive proportions. He battles the fish, weather, sharks, and cuts to his hand, but never gives up. That's the basic plot of the story. Even though Santiago, the aged fisherman, eventually makes it to shore with his catch after 2 harrowing days at sea, all that's left is the skeleton of the fish. Sharks ate nearly all of the marlin because Santiago's boat was too small to hold it. He had to strap it to the side of his boat, and the sharks had a buffet. Keep your plot simple and clear. The message or lesson of the story is that if you want to accomplish something, you should never give up, no matter what gets in your way. The plot is also simple and crystal clear. You have a fisherman in a boat and a fish he's trying to catch. That's the gist of it. It's easy to get into the story because you aren't distracted by a bunch of unnecessary characters and subplots. Remember, you'll tell better stories if you have a clearly defined and simple plot that your readers can easily follow. Are you using the 5 C's of great storytelling? Successful writers will tell you there are always certain components to a successful story. They'll also tell you that rules are made to be broken. That means if your story doesn't have the components we're about to discuss, it's not necessarily going to be a flop. You can still tell great stories if you're missing one or two of the following pieces we're going to talk about. You're just making the job more difficult on yourself. Most of the time, you need to have the following 5 C's in your story. 1. Circumstances. 2. Conflict. 3. Crisis. 4. Climax. 5. Conclusion. To paint a clear picture, let's use the Cinderella fairy tale. Cinderella has a pitiful life with her evil stepsisters and stepmother who constantly harass her. She receives an invitation to the royal ball. Alas, she has nothing to wear and no way to get to the ball. Her fairy godmother appears and supplies her with a dress and coach to transport her. Cinderella is told she must be back before midnight. She goes to the ball, the prince falls in love with her, then midnight strikes and she's back to her less than enviable life. She lost a shoe at the ball and the prince finds it. He tries it on the feet of the women in his kingdom and eventually finds Cinderella. They live happily ever after. Circumstances? Cinderella has a difficult life cleaning for her stepmother and stepsisters, and they constantly bully and mistreat her. Conflict? She's ecstatic she received an invitation to the royal ball, but she has nothing to wear, and if she did have a suitable gown, how would she get to the ball? Crisis? She's having the time of her life, but has to leave the prince before midnight strikes, and he discovers who she really is. Climax? The prince finds her, and she once again has hopes for a great life. Conclusion? They live happily ever after. You can see if you had those 5 components figured out, then you would only need to flesh out the story. If you can create your own 5 C's before you begin writing your story, it makes it simple to fill in the blanks. You're providing yourself an outline that's been proven to engage your audience and compel them to keep on reading. Use the 5 C's of crafting a story, and your storytelling ability will grow. Use these 4 P's to tell a better story. Some of the best-selling books of all time were rejected when they were first proposed to dozens and sometimes hundreds of publishers. Then they were finally accepted and made their authors wealthy. They were read by millions and millions of people. So why did many would-be publishers pass on those manuscripts? Sometimes it's because an experienced publisher didn't find certain components in the story. When something works time and again, it's hard to make an argument for abandoning it. It's like the old saying that tells us if something isn't broken, why would we try to fix it? You might do nothing more than mess up something that's working fine already. Traditional publishers don't like taking chances. Their job is on the line. They'd rather play it safe and publish a manuscript that has a lot of the same features of past successful books. That can keep their company making money and keep them employed. One of the things publishers look for in a manuscript is the presence of the 4 P's. Consider the people, place, plot, and purpose of your story. That might sound like common sense. Of course there are people in your story. It happens someplace. You know the plot and you have a purpose. Your purpose is the lesson you're trying to teach, the information you're passing on, or the benefit your audience is going to receive. If these things don't seem too important, think about some stories you really enjoy. You can probably recall the important people in the story, as well as its setting, its plot, and its purpose. Those components of the story stuck out in your mind because they were a point of focus. Take time to focus on the 4 P's. Before you craft your story, consider the people you're going to talk about. In most cases, successful storytelling means a limited number of characters. You don't want your readers or listeners to have too much on their plate. Don't distract them with unnecessary characters. Make the important people in your story memorable and relatable if you can. Where does the story take place? Again, limit your focus here. Talk about the important aspects of the setting and leave everything else out. What's the plot? What's happening? Develop a clear and simple beginning, middle, and end. And stick to your plot. Finally, what's the purpose of your story? Why would someone read it? The 4 P's of storytelling can make you a better writer. You can prepare better speeches, write better video scripts, and sell more books. Take time to flesh out the people, place, plot, and purpose of your story, and you'll get a much better reception from your audience. Write better stories with these 5 tips from Elmore Leonard. Elmore Leonard wrote crime fiction. That's not a genre that gets much respect from the literary crowd. In Leonard's case, he's beloved not only by fans of fiction where crime is a centerpiece, but also by critics that realize he was an unparalleled storyteller. He's one of those writers who won't allow you to go to sleep at night. You lie in bed and simply can't stop reading an extra page. Then you read another, and before you know it, your chance at a good night's sleep is gone. As many successful authors do during their heyday, Elmore Leonard gave a lot of advice about writing. He did that in his book, Elmore Leonard's 10 Rules of Writing. Let's look at 5 of the lessons from his book that can improve your ability to tell stories that keep your readers engaged. 1. Avoid detailed descriptions of characters. This might take you by surprise. You may believe that the more detail you give, the better picture you paint. Actually, you limit your audience's ability to identify a character when you describe any and every detail. When you have a dozen people listening to you, they're going to have a dozen different ideas about your characters. Let them form images in their mind that make sense to each of them, rather than telling them everything about the people in your story. 2. Never use a verb other than said to carry dialogue. Avoid she pontificated or he exclaimed when talking about what someone's saying. Fluff is never good in a story, whether you're telling or writing it. Get straight to the point and don't use unnecessary words when a simple word will work. 3. Use regional dialect, patois, sparingly. Many writers and speakers assume that regional dialect and speech patterns add flavor to a story. What they do in many cases is frustrate your listeners or readers. Not everyone's going to identify with dialect, speaking patterns, and grammar usage that isn't common everywhere. Add a little bit here or there where it makes sense, but don't overdo it. 4. Never open a book with weather. Whether writing a book, preparing a speech, or telling a story as part of an assignment in school, don't start with "it was a rainy night." Unless weather is a central part of your story, wait until further along to add it as a character. 5. Avoid prologues. If you need a prologue to set up your story, you should do some more work. Everything should be told in the framework of your story. Make sure your prologue, chapter 1, or better yet, weave that content throughout your story. If you want a bit of advice from the legendary storyteller himself that sums up all the tips above, remember what Leonard once told a struggling writer. If it sounds like writing, I rewrite it. That's true with storytelling as well as writing. Don't talk technical. Talk like people speak with incomplete sentences. Be a grammatical lawbreaker. Get to know your audience and talk like they do. Use these tips when you're preparing to tell a story, and your audience will be glad you did.